Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is great to have you with us. Today, we are going to try and do something a little bit difficult. We are going to try and disrupt a very comfortable, very standard mental image that I think almost all of us carry around in our heads.
It's one of those things that once you see it, you can't really unsee it. It changes how you look at a map, how you walk through a museum, and
Ah,
and even how you understand the news headlines today.
exactly. We're talking about the relationship between two massive historical forces. On one side of the ring, you have science. And when I say science with a capital S, I have a very specific vibe in mind.
hmm
I'm thinking about the pursuit of truth. I'm thinking about guys in white lab coats, quiet observatories, microscopes, peer-reviewed journals. It feels very noble. It feels
It was
objective.
pure.
Pure, exactly. And above all, it feels neutral.
Right. It's the quest for knowledge's sake. It's about understanding how the universe works, just
Correct.
for the sake of understanding.
And then on the other side of the ring, you have empire, imperialism. And that image is totally different. That is soldiers in red coats, muskets, planting flags on beaches.
Conquering territory, looting gold, subjugating people.
Yes. It's brutal, it's political, and it is definitely not neutral. It is about power, pure and simple.
We tend to keep these two things in completely separate mental boxes. One box is for the scholars and the explorers who want to understand the world, and the other box is for the generals and the politicians who want to dominate it.
But the source material we are diving into today, which covers the global history of the last 500 years, argues that this distinction is a complete illusion. It argues that modern science and European imperialism aren't just distant cousins, they aren't just casually related.
They're the same project.
They're married.
It is a marriage where you really cannot understand one without the other.
The central argument here is that the rise of Europe, from what the source calls a frigid finger of Eurasia to the master of the globe, was driven by a feedback loop. Science built empire, and empire built science. That phrase, frigid finger of Eurasia, that really sets the stage for the scale of this transformation. We're looking roughly at the period from, say, 1500 to 1900, and we're trying to answer perhaps the biggest question in macro history: why Europe?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Why did Captain Cook conquer Australia instead of a Chinese admiral conquering New Zealand?
Exactly, because it is the paradox of history. If you look at the world in 1400 or even 1500, the smart money would not have been on London or Paris or Madrid.
Oh, not at all. The smart money would have been on Beijing or Istanbul or Delhi. The Ming Dynasty in China, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire in India. These were the economic giants. They were sophisticated, wealthy, and stable.
And Europe was, by comparison, a chaotic backwater. So the question is, how did that balance shift so dramatically and so quickly? How did the dwarf become the giant?
And as we'll see today, the answer isn't just better guns or steam engines. That's part of it, but much later. The real answer is about a mindset. A peculiar mindset that married the scientist's curiosity with the conqueror's ambition.
We are going to trace that mindset through some incredible stories today. We'll look at the transit of Venus, which was basically the 18th century equivalent of the space race.
A huge, huge international effort. And we'll talk about the medical nightmare of scurvy and how lemons basically conquered the ocean.
We'll also look at how maps changed from being full of monsters to being full of empty space, and why that empty space matters so much psychologically.
And we'll get into the alien invasion of the Americas, which is a terrifying and I think really eye-opening way to reframe the Spanish conquest.
Yeah, that part is wow.
And finally, we will see how this marriage of science and empire eventually curdled into something very dark: the scientific justification of racism and the ideologies that shape the modern world.
There is so much to unpack here, so let's jump right in. Let's start with a story that I think perfectly encapsulates this double-edged sword of science and empire, the story of Captain James Cook and the transit of Venus.
This is the perfect starting point because it shows just how blurry the line between pure exploration and military innovation really was. You literally cannot separate them in this story.
But before we get to the ships and the soldiers, we have to start with the science. In the mid-18th century, the scientific community had a massive problem. They were obsessed with a specific puzzle.
They needed to figure out the exact distance between the Earth and the Sun.
It sounds like a piece of trivia today, right?
What?
You just Google it. It's about 93 million miles.
Yeah, we take it for granted. But back then, this was the holy grail of astronomy. Copernicus had already proven that the Earth goes around the Sun, but they didn't know the scale. They had a map of the solar system, but it had no key.
So they didn't know if the sun was 1 million miles away or 100 million.
Exactly. And that mattered so much, not just for curiosity's sake, but because without that number, what we call the astronomical unit, they couldn't calculate the size of the rest of the solar system or the distance to other stars. They were stuck. They were navigating the cosmos without a ruler.
Okay, so they're desperate for this number. And a brilliantly clever astronomer named Edmund Halley,
The comet guy.
the comet guy, yeah, he had proposed a method to solve it, but it was incredibly complicated.
It involved the planet Venus.
Mm-hmm.
Halley realized that every 100 years or so, Venus passes directly between the Earth and the Sun. This is called a transit. And to us, on Earth, it just looks like a tiny black dot moving across the burning face of the Sun.
So how does watching a little black dot help you measure distance?
It relies on a concept called parallax. It's simple trigonometry, really. If you want to try it, just hold your thumb up at arm's length. Now close your left eye and look at your thumb against the background. Then switch and close your right eye.
Right, it looks like my thumb jumps back and forth.
It jumps because you're looking at it from two slightly different angles.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine the Earth is your face, and your two eyes are two observers standing on opposite sides of the globe. So one observer is at the very top of the Earth, say in Norway, and the other is at the very bottom in Tahiti. If they both look at Venus at the exact same moment during the transit, they will see it cross the Sun along slightly different paths.
The planet jumps.
The planet jumps. And if you measure that tiny difference in the path, that angle, and you know the exact distance between your two observers, you can use trigonometry to calculate the distance to Venus, and from there, the distance to the Sun.
So it's a massive geometry problem, but it's a geometry problem that requires a logistical miracle. You need precise observations from opposite ends of the globe at the exact same moment with 18th century technology.
And the next transit was predicted for 1769. The European scientific community went into overdrive. I mean, this was arguably the first big science project in history. The Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific body in the world, knew they had to get someone to the Pacific Ocean to get that southern measurement.
But the Pacific is vast, dangerous, and incredibly expensive to traverse. The Royal Society have the brains, but they don't have the budget. And they certainly don't have the heavy frigates needed to survive a voyage like that.
So they do what scientists have done for centuries. They went to the government.
Specifically to the Royal Navy.
And this is the moment the marriage is consummated. Because the Royal Navy isn't a charity. They aren't interested in how far the sun is just for the poetry of it. They have other priorities.
They have an agenda.
A big one. But they are interested in the Pacific. They know there are islands there. They suspect there's a great southern continent, Terra Australis. They see potential colonies, strategic bases, resources. So they cut a deal.
What's the deal?
They say, we will give you the ship, we will give you the funding, but we are going to pick the commander, and he is going to have a second secret set of orders.
And they picked James Cook.
Cook was the perfect hybrid for this dual mission. He was an experienced naval officer, a tough seaman who could handle a rough crew, but he was also a brilliant mathematician and cartographer. He embodied this union of the scholar and the soldier.
And the ship they outfitted, the HMS Endeavour, it was a floating paradox. If you looked at it from one angle, it was a laboratory.
Truly. They packed it with the astronomer Charles Green. They brought Joseph Banks, who was a wealthy celebrity botanist, along with his assistant Daniel Solander. They brought artists to sketch new species. They had the latest telescopes and timepieces. It was a mission of enlightenment.
But if you looked at it from another angle,
it was a warship. It carried 85 sailors and Marines. It was armed with 10 cannons and 12 swivel guns.
Yeah.
It had muskets, gunpowder, cutlasses. It was a projection of lethal force.
So off they go. They sail to Tahiti. They set up their observatory. They watch the little black dot cross the sun. They get the data. Mission accomplished for science.
But the mission for empire was just beginning. Cook opened his sealed orders. He didn't turn around and go home. He spent the next few years reconnoitering the Pacific. He meticulously mapped the entire coast of New Zealand. He landed in Botany Bay in Australia.
And he collected an insane amount of data. This is what distinguishes this from just, looting. Banks and his team collected something like 30,000 plant specimens.
Yeah, they illustrated animals no European had ever seen. The kangaroo, for instance. They were genuinely curious.
But alongside the botany, Cook was claiming territory. He planted the Union Jack. He claimed Australia for King George III. He was laying the groundwork for British ownership of an entire continent.
And this brings us to a specific technological breakthrough from that voyage that I think is often misunderstood. We usually think of technology as machines, steam engines, compasses, better sails. But The source argues the biggest breakthrough on Cook's ship was medical,
Scurvy.
the absolute terror of the seas.
God, the description of scurvy in the source material is just haunting. I think modern people, we think of it as just being a bit tired or needing some orange juice.
It is horrific.
Yeah.
It is a breakdown of the body at a cellular level. Humans, unlike most animals, cannot produce vitamin C. Without it, our body can't make collagen. And collagen is, well, it's the glue that holds our tissues together.
So you literally start to fall apart.
Your gums swell and turn black. Your teeth become loose and fall out. You get massive internal bleeding. But the psychological horror is what gets me. One of the symptoms is that old wounds open up.
That's the detail that stuck with me. If you had a cut on your arm from 20 years ago that had fully healed, the scar tissue dissolves and the wound just reopens.
It is terrifying. Sailors would become lethargic, depressed, and eventually die of heart failure. Between 1500 and 1800, it is estimated scurvy killed 2 million sailors.
2 million.
2 million. That's more than all the naval battles, shipwrecks, and storms combined. It was the Black Death of the ocean.
And it was the limiting factor of empire, right? You couldn't send a fleet to the Pacific to fight a war if half your crew would be dead before they even got there.
Exactly. It was a logistical wall that no navy could climb.
Now, a Scottish doctor named James Lind had figured out the cure in 1747. He did a controlled experiment, which in itself was a huge scientific milestone, and found that citrus fruits cured it. But the Navy was slow to adopt it.
It was expensive to carry lemons, and they didn't really understand the chemistry. They didn't know why it worked, just that it did.
But Cook was a believer. He was a man of science. He decided to prove it works. He loaded the Endeavour with massive quantities of sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut? Why sauerkraut?
Cabbage has vitamin C, and pickling it preserves it. It was the perfect long voyage food. But the sailors, they hated it. They weren't used to it.
So what did Cook do?
He used psychology. He served it to the officers and the gentlemen on board at the captain's table, but didn't offer it to the crew. The crew saw the officers eating this special food, and suddenly they wanted it. Once they started eating it, he made it mandatory. He also forced his men to forage for fresh greens whenever they landed. He'd flog men who refused to eat their vegetables.
Tough love. But what was the result?
In a 3-year voyage to the other side of the world, Cook lost 0 men to scurvy. Not one.
That is the moon landing equivalent of maritime health.
It changed everything. And here is where the feedback loop tightens. This medical miracle saving lives immediately became a weapon of war.
Because now, the British Navy has a superpower.
A superpower. They can keep a fleet at sea for months without docking. They can blockade enemy ports indefinitely. They can project power to New Zealand or China without the attrition that crippled other navies.
Exactly. The cure for scurvy wasn't just humanitarian. It was a military revolution. It allowed Britain to become the global policeman. It allowed them to dominate the world's oceans for a century.
So we have the benign, side-mapping the stars, curing disease, discovering kangaroos. But we have to look at the cost. Because for the people living in those new lands, this scientific expedition was the apocalypse.
Specifically, let's look at Tasmania. Cook didn't conquer it personally, but his maps paved the way. British settlers arrived in 1803.
And within 70 years?
The native population was effectively exterminated. The source calls it one of the most complete genocides in history.
It was. The Tasmanians had been isolated for 10,000 years. The British arrived with this mindset of improvement and civilization. They drove the natives off the hunting grounds to make room for sheep. When the natives resisted, they were hunted down.
And the survivors, what happened to them?
They were rounded up and put into what the source calls an evangelical concentration camp. Missionaries tried to teach them reading, writing, Christianity, sewing, the arts of civilization.
And the result was tragic. The source says they simply refused to live, they stopped having children, they became melancholic and died.
But the marriage of science and empire didn't even leave them alone in death. This is the part that is truly chilling. Science demanded specimens.
Oh, right. The anthropologists and anatomists wanted to study these primitive people.
They viewed the Tasmanians as a missing link between humans and apes. So they seized the bodies, they cut off heads to measure skull capacity, they put skeletons in museums.
The story of Trugani is the heartbreaking climax of this. She was the last full-blooded Tasmanian. She had seen her entire people wiped out. She knew what the scientists did to the dead.
So on her deathbed, she begged them, "Don't let them cut me up." She wanted to be buried at sea, safe from the scalpel.
Yeah, what happened?
She died in 1876. The Royal Society of Tasmania dug her up, defleshed her bones, and put her skeleton on display in the Hobart Museum.
How long did it stay there?
It stayed there until 1976, 100 years. People walking by, looking at the specimen, completely ignoring the human tragedy.
For Tregeney, there was no difference between the soldier who shot her family and the scientist who stole her bones.
They were the same force. They were both agents of a civilization that believed it had the right to measure, map, and own everything it touched.
Which brings us to the broader question the source material poses, the why Europe question. We've seen the how with Cook, the ships, the guns, the scurvy cure. But why was it Europe that developed this specific obsession with global conquest?
It is the great paradox. In 1775, even as Cook was sailing, Asia was still the engine of the world. China and India accounted for 80% of the global economy. Europe was an economic dwarf.
And we usually assume the answer is technology. We think, oh, Europe had the Industrial Revolution.
But that came later. In the 1500s, 1600s, even the 1700s, the technological gap wasn't that big. The Ottomans made cannons just as good as the Europeans. The Chinese had invented gunpowder and the compass centuries earlier.
So if it wasn't the tools.
It was the craftsman. It was the mindset. The source argues that the scientist and the conqueror share a unique revolutionary habit of thought, the admission of ignorance. It sounds so simple, but it was radical. Pre-modern cultures, whether Christian, Muslim, or Confucian, generally believed that the Golden Age was in the past. Everything worth knowing was already in the holy books.
Right. The Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Confucian classics. If it wasn't in there, it wasn't important.
Exactly. And you see this in their maps. If you look at a medieval world map, a mappa mundi, it's full. There are no empty spaces. It shows Europe, Africa, Asia. If they didn't know what was in a corner, they'd draw a dragon or a king with a dog's head.
They fill the void with mythology.
The map said, we know everything.
And if the map is full, there is no reason to explore. You explore to find something new. If you think you already know it all, you stay home.
But then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, something shifts in Europe. The maps start to change.
They start leaving vast areas blank. White space.
That must have been psychologically jarring.
It was an invitation. A blank spot on a map is a magnet. It screams, we don't know what is here, go find out. It legitimized curiosity. It made the admission of ignorance a virtue.
We can see this clash of mindsets perfectly in the story of Christopher Columbus versus Amerigo Vespucci.
Columbus is so fascinating because he is a transitional figure. He acted like a modern explorer. He got the funding, he took the risk, but he thought like a medieval man.
He sailed across the Atlantic in 1492, landed in the Bahamas, and said, I have found Asia.
And he stuck to that until his death. He refused to accept that he had found a new continent. And you have to ask why. Because the Bible and the ancient Greek geographers said there were 3 continents: Europe, Africa, Asia. A 4th continent didn't fit the complete knowledge model.
He couldn't admit he didn't know where he was. He couldn't admit the old books were wrong.
So he called the people Indians, a mistake we are still living with today. But then comes Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian sailor a few years later. He sails the coast of South America, looks at the delta of the Amazon, looks at the stars and says, wait a minute, this isn't Asia. This is a new world.
He trusted his observations over the ancient texts.
He admitted ignorance. He said, we didn't know this existed. And there's a poetic justice in what happened next. A German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller was drawing a new map. He read Vespucci's letters. He believed him. So he wrote the name America on the new continent.
A quarter of the world is named after a fairly obscure Italian sailor, just because he had the guts to say, the old books are wrong.
That is the scientific revolution in a nutshell. Observation over tradition. And that mindset powered the imperial expansion.
Now, to play devil's advocate, let's look at the counterexample. The source brings up the famous Chinese Admiral Zheng, because if anyone could have discovered America and conquered the world, it was him.
Zheng, he is the ultimate what-if of history. This is the early 1400s. We're talking decades before Columbus. He led 7 massive expeditions from China into the Indian Ocean.
When you say massive, what's the scale we're talking about?
We're talking armadas of 300 ships and 30,000 men. His command ship, the treasure junk, was 400 feet long.
And Columbus.
Columbus had 3 little wooden tubs, maybe 120 men total. The source compares Columbus's fleet to 3 mosquitoes. Compared to Zheng, he's drove of dragons.
So China had the tech, they had the resources, they could have rounded Africa, they could have crossed the Pacific.
Easily. But they didn't. Zheng, he visited Africa, collected some tribute, brought back a giraffe for the emperor, and went home. And when the political winds changed in Beijing, the new emperor dismantled the fleet.
They burned the ships.
They burned the ships and the logs. They banned the construction of ocean-going vessels
Why? That seems insane to a modern Western mind.
because they lacked the interest. The Chinese elites believed they were the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. What could the barbarians outside possibly offer them? They had no burning question, no blank space on their mental map that needed filling.
They felt completely self-sufficient.
Exactly. Europe was hungry, Europe was fractured, competitive, and desperate for resources. China was content. It was that lack of ambition, that lack of a conquest mindset that allowed the tiny European mosquito to eventually dominate the Chinese dragon.
That ambition, though, when it finally arrived on the shores of the New World, it was terrifying. The source uses a metaphor here that I found incredibly helpful. It describes the Spanish arrival not as exploration, but as an alien invasion.
It's the only way to really understand the shock. Imagine you are an Aztec in 1519. You know your world, you know the tribes around you, you know the geography, you have your gods, your politics.
And suddenly on the beach, these things appear.
Think about the sensory overload. The Spanish had white skin, which the Aztecs hadn't seen. They had beards, thick facial hair, which the natives didn't have. Their hair was the color of the sun.
And the smell, you mentioned the smell.
Yes. The source points out that Aztec hygiene was impeccable. Daily baths, the Spanish. Well, 16th century Europeans believed bathing opened the pores to disease. They smell like rotting onions and old sweat.
And then the technology.
They are riding horses. The Aztecs had no large beasts of burden. To them, a man on a horse looked like a single, terrifying centaur beast. They run faster than a deer and can trample men.
And they wield lightning.
Gunpowder. The noise, the smoke, the flash, and the steel armor that their stone-tipped spears just couldn't penetrate. It was literally otherworldly.
The source argues that this alien nature caused a fatal paralysis.
The Aztecs didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these gods? Was it the god Quetzalcoatl returning, as some prophecies said? Were they demons? Were they men? They debated it in the court of Montezuma. They hesitated.
Meanwhile, Hernan Cortés, the Spanish commander, had no such doubts.
Cortés was a modern man. He was cynical, practical, and in a way scientific in his approach. He didn't think they were demons. He thought, these are people. They have gold. How do I get it?
He understood the concept of the other. He was comfortable plunging into the unknown.
And he exploited the information gap. He noticed the Aztec Empire was fractured. The subject tribes hated the Aztec ruling class. So Cortés played the diplomat. He went to the Tlaxcalans and said, hey, help me, and I'll free you from Montezuma.
So he built a coalition of locals to do the fighting for him.
The locals thought they were using Cortés to settle a local score. They didn't realize they were inviting in a global empire that would crush them all. They lacked the global context. They didn't know about the Spanish genocides in the Caribbean.
It's strictly an information asymmetry.
Exactly. And this repeats almost identically 10 years later with the Incas. Francisco Pizarro shows up in Peru with 168 men.
168 men against the Inca Empire, which had millions of subjects and huge armies. It should have been a massacre.
It should have been. But Pizarro had the knowledge. He had read Cortés's playbook. He knew exactly what to do. Go to the capital, pretend to be peaceful, kidnap the king, and paralyze the state.
And the Incas.
They knew nothing about Mexico. Mexico is only a few thousand miles away, but there was no trade, no communication. The Incas walked into the exact same trap the Aztecs did.
Parochialism was fatal.
If the Incas had known that white men are untrustworthy invaders who kidnap kings, they would have slaughtered Pizarro on the beach. But they were operating in a bubble of ignorance.
There is a story in the source, an anecdote involving the Apollo astronauts, that sums up this learning curve beautifully.
Oh, I love this story. It's almost certainly apocryphal, a legend, but it's mythically true. It captures the essence of the experience.
So the Apollo astronauts are training in the deserts of the American West in the late 60s. The landscape looks like the moon, and they run into an old Navajo elder.
The elder asks what they are doing. They explain, we are training to go to the moon. The elder gets very quiet. He thinks for a moment. He asks if they can do him a favor. Can you deliver a message to the Holy Spirits who live on the moon?
The astronauts play along. Sure. The elder teaches them a phrase in Navajo. He makes them repeat it until they have it perfect, but he refuses to say what it means. It's a secret between my tribe and the moon spirits.
The astronauts get back to base, and they are dying of curiosity. They find a translator who speaks Navajo. They say the phrase, and the translator just cracks up laughing.
What does he say?
He says the message means, don't believe a single word these people tell you. They have come to steal your lands.
Laughs. It is perfect. It's the indigenous experience of the last 500 years distilled into one sentence.
It shows that eventually the ignorance gap closes. But by then, it's usually too late.
So we've talked about the conquest, but the marriage of science and empire didn't end when the fighting stopped. In fact, that's when it got really sophisticated.
Right. Once you conquer a place, you have to rule it. And to rule it efficiently, you need data. You need maps, censuses, linguistic studies, botanical surveys.
This is the shift from looting to governance. The British in India didn't just grab the diamonds and run, they set up the Great Survey of India.
It lasted 60 years. They triangulated the entire subcontinent. They measured the height of Mount Everest, which is named after the British Surveyor General George Everest. They categorized every snake, every spider, every caste, every language.
Why go to that trouble? What's the point?
Knowledge is power. Literally. If you understand the caste system better than the locals do, you can manipulate it. If you understand the legal history, you can write laws that seem traditional but serve your interests.
Let's talk about linguistics, because we usually think of studying ancient grammar as the ultimate ivory tower pursuit. Totally useless.
But for the empire, it was a tool of control. British officers arriving in India were required to learn the languages: Sanskrit, Urdu, Persian.
And this leads to William Jones.
Sir William Jones, a judge in Calcutta in the 1780s. He was a linguistic genius. He started studying Sanskrit, the ancient holy language of India, and he noticed something weird. The words for mother and father and God were incredibly similar to Greek and Latin.
Like matar in Sanskrit, mater in Latin.
Exactly. He realized that Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, German, English, they all branched off from a single ancient ancestor language. This was the discovery of the Indo-European language family.
Scientifically, that is a massive breakthrough. It unified human history.
It was. But politically, it gave the British a massive advantage. It allowed a tiny corps of British civil servants, sometimes fewer than 5,000 men, to administer a population of 300 million. They unlocked the source code of Indian culture.
It also allowed them to play the role of the benevolent guardian. They could say, look, we are restoring your history for you.
Yes, the British archaeologist excavated Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley civilization. Most locals had forgotten it existed. The British said, "We are giving you back your past."
Or the story of Henry Rawlinson and the cuneiform scripts in the Middle East.
Another classic Indiana Jones moment. Rawlinson was a British army officer in Persia. He found the Behistun inscription, a massive carving on a cliff face.
And this was written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Mesopotamia. Nobody had been able to read it for 2,000 years. It was a dead script.
Rawlinson risked his life to copy it. He hung off the cliff on a rope ladder. He even hired a local Kurdish boy to scurry out to the most dangerous overhangs to take paper impressions of the script.
And he deciphered the code.
He did. Suddenly, we could read the Epic of Gilgamesh. We could hear the voices of ancient Babylon.
And the empire takes the credit. We aren't invaders. We are enlightened scholars preserving civilization.
It provides the moral justification. You natives are too ignorant to appreciate your own history. We will hold it for you in the British Museum.
And that moral justification leads us into the darkest chapter, because science didn't just map the land, it mapped the people, and it created hierarchies.
This is where the feedback loop turns toxic. This is the white man's burden.
Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, the idea that white Europeans had a moral duty to rule over the sullen, caught peoples, half devil and half child, to bring them roads, medicine, and Jesus.
But while they were preaching about bringing civilization, they were often causing devastation. Look at the Bengal famine of 1769.
This happened right when Cook was sailing.
The British East India Company mismanaged the province so badly that when a drought hit, 10 million Bengalis died, 1/3 of the population.
But the British didn't see this as a failure of their rule.
No. They often viewed it through a Malthusian scientific lens. Oh, the population was too high, nature is correcting it. It was treated as a statistical event rather than a human tragedy.
And then we have the Aryan theory. This connects back to William Jones and the languages.
This is a tragic irony. Jones discovers a linguistic fact. Indian and European languages are related, but later scholars twisted this into a biological fantasy.
They hypothesized a race of people, the Aryans, who spoke this original language.
And they reasoned. Well, the Aryans who went to Europe founded Greece, Rome, and Britain, the conquerors. The Aryans who went to India mixed with the locals and degenerated. That's why India is weak and Britain is strong.
So they used linguistics to prove that Europeans were biologically superior.
Pure Aryans. This gave racism the stamp of scientific authority. It wasn't just, I don't like you. It was, evolution proves I should rule you.
And we know where that road ends. It ends in the gas chambers of World War II. The Nazis loved the Aryan theory.
They took it to its logical, horrific extreme.
Now, the source makes a really interesting pivot to the present day. It argues that today, in the 21st century, biological racism is scientifically dead.
Right. Geneticists have proven there is no such thing as white blood or black blood in any meaningful sense. The genetic diversity within Africa is greater than the diversity between Africa and Europe. We are all incredibly closely related.
But the source says racism hasn't disappeared, it has just mutated. It's now culturism.
This is a subtle but dangerous shift. Look at anti-immigration rhetoric in Europe today.
Yeah.
A politician like Marine Le Pen in France doesn't say, we don't want these people because their genes are inferior.
No, that would end her career.
She says, we don't want them because their culture is incompatible with ours. She talks about values. We believe in democracy, women's rights, secularism. They come from a culture of hierarchy and religious fundamentalism.
So the argument is, it's not their race, it's their software.
Exactly. And the source points out that this is much harder to fight because biological racism is a lie. But cultural differences are real. French culture is different from Syrian culture.
So how do you argue against it?
It's difficult.
Yeah.
Science can debunk biology, but history confirms cultural friction. It allows discrimination to continue under the guise of protecting our values.
It's the same mechanic, using knowledge, or selected knowledge, to justify exclusion, but the target has shifted.
It's the legacy of that marriage. Science creates categories, whether it's mammal versus reptile or Western versus Eastern, and power uses those categories to draw borders and build walls.
We have covered a massive arc here, from the transit of Venus to the empty maps, from the tragedy of the Tasmanians to the deciphering of cuneiform.
It's a heavy story.
If we try to synthesize this for the listener, what is the one big takeaway?
I think it's that we have to stop being naive about knowledge. We grew up thinking knowledge is power in a metaphorical sense. But in history, knowledge is the partner of physical power.
The scientists wanted to know. The conqueror wanted to rule.
And they realized they could help each other. The scientist said, I need a ship to get to Tahiti. The conqueror said, I need a map to invade the Pacific. And they shook hands.
And that handshake built the modern world. The fact that we are speaking English, the fact that the global economy is integrated, the fact that we have a global scientific community, it all comes from that feedback loop.
We are the children of that marriage, for better and for worse.
Now, the source mentions one missing link that we haven't touched on.
The third wheel, or really the engine room,
Yeah.
capitalism.
Right. Because ships are expensive. Telescopes are expensive.
Columbus needed bank loans. Cook needed the treasury. The rise of science and empire is also the story of the rise of credit and capital, but that is a massive topic.
I think that deserves its own deep dive.
Absolutely.
So I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We talked about the empty maps, the psychological breakthrough of admitting, I don't know.
Yes, that was the spark.
In 1500, the empty spaces were oceans and continents. Today, if you look at Google Earth, the map is full. Every square inch is photographed.
So where are the empty maps today?
That's the question. Science is more powerful than ever. We have AI, we have biotech, we are decoding the human brain, we are mapping the genome.
Those are the new continents.
So are we still operating with that conquest mentality? When we rush to colonize the digital space or colonize the human genetic code? Are we the Captain Cooks of the 21st century?
And if so, who are the Tasmanians? Who gets crushed when the new maps are filled in?
That is a question that might keep you up at night. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.